Welcome to the How to Be Moderately Successful podcast. I'm your host, Mike Scott, and I'm also the co-founder and CEO of Nona Digital. In this podcast, we explore FinTech and the founders that power it. We look at how to build better FinTech products, better FinTech businesses, and how to work on yourself to be as effective as possible. This podcast is sponsored by ourselves, Nona Digital. We are an expert firm that consults on, designs, and develops FinTech software, and we do it with a level of care and excellence that is rare and difficult to match. Working with us, you get access to a deeply skilled and experienced FinTech design and development team with a particularly deep experience level in blockchain. You get the benefit of a team that is big enough for no key person dependencies to exist, but small enough so that you're always close to the principles. And you get the benefit of our reusable component library, which means we're able to launch your FinTech product sooner than anyone else could at a comparable standard. Get in touch to book a call with me, with one of our principals, to see how we can help your FinTech project accelerate and succeed. And now onto the show. I'm joined today by Nitin Gaur, who is an early adopter, change maker, and thought leader in the blockchain space, and who brings with him a wealth of knowledge and experience starting pretty much right at the beginning of the crypto movement. Nitin has been with IBM for 22 years and has founded and held a number of senior titles therein, most of which have been related to blockchain. Currently, he is the Director of Financial Sciences and Digital Assets. Previously, Nitin founded the IBM Blockchain Labs and led the effort in establishing the blockchain practice for enterprise. Nitin is also an advisory board member to Stanford University's Future Digital Currency Initiative. Nitin is widely published, mostly on blockchain-related topics, and holds over 100 patents. Really excited to have you on the show, Nitin. Welcome, and thanks for making the time.
Mike, really glad to be here, and thanks for having me on this show. Looking forward to an amazing conversation, and let's have fun.
Awesome. Fantastic. So, look, let's just start with kind of your journey. You're clearly a very capable guy. You started off in what looks like software engineering. You did an MBA with a finance focus. So something drew you to, let's just call it the broader realm of FinTech. Talk to me about how you went from a software engineer that's clearly very smart and technical into the world of FinTech. Tell me how that all happened.
No, I think that's a great start. And this is an amazing story for me as well. Every time I revisit this, it makes me wonder as to how, I got into this space. So I was actually focusing on building middleware systems for financial institutions. Middleware systems are the systems that sit between your back office mainframe systems to be able to enable new services on web, and eventually new services on your mobile devices. And in that journey, I begin to sort of look into the challenges of payments, looked into as to, besides just the user interface and what banks were trying to do, there were a lot of back office systems that need to be revamped. And in that journey, I think at the time IBM founded, and I founded this in IBM, the mobile payment space, we were looking into sort of removing all the frictions. This is pre-Apple Pay, of course. We were looking into figuring out as to how mobile devices can play a role of mobile wallets, and how can payment be seamless, frictionless, and not just domestic payments of the low-value payments. This is things that me and you buy for coffee and apple juice and so on and so forth, but more towards movement of money across the globe. And at that time, I was researching as to what should IBM focus on, what should my company focus on, because payment is a very complicated and a fragment space. And I met, I think at the time, about 65 different payment processors in different ecosystems. That includes all the card services, all the payment processors, all the manufacturers of your point of sale systems. And one theme began to pop up in every conversation was Bitcoin and blockchain. And this is 2011, 2012. And I think after about 65 different trips, I came back and I said, I need to look into this because this is popping up in all my conversations. And we had very peripheral knowledge on what Bitcoin is. So I spent 3 months of heads down researching the hell out of blockchain and Bitcoin and what is the whole intent and what it's trying to solve. And there was this moment when I'm sure we all go to that moment that, a light clicked and saying that, this could really disrupt the entire financial services industry and not just payments. And, as you would do in a large corporation, you have to make a business case. I spent some time in getting sponsorship, reaching out to many of the executives to be able to make some investments. And the question came up that you must be crazy if you think we're going to work with Bitcoin. Only because IBM, as you know, is a large corporation and we work with a lot of regulated financial institutions. 90% of our banks are clients. And so there was this skepticism in making that investment. So it took me about a year and a half or two to convince some of execs to say, look, all we do is transaction systems, right? We have built the world's existing financial systems, the technology that powers the payment system, the technology that powers your stock exchanges is all built on our tech. And so, my case was that look at blockchain as a transaction system, not Bitcoin as a payment instrument at the time. And it's as disruptive as to us as it is to our financial services client base. And that resonated with some of the execs, and the investment was made, and we went all in. We were a fairly big investment we made in 2013, 2014. I spent about 18 months devising the strategy, what we need to do from going to market. And we announced to the world in 2014, 2015 timeframe that we are going forward with blockchain and then begin to address the industry phase. So that was my entry point. And I'll tell you this, that I've had many roles in IBM. I've made it a point not to stay in one place for more than 3 years to avoid complacency. But as a founder, you don't have the choice anymore, in the sense that you are now stuck to this whole thing because it's your baby and you want to see it through. So I'll pause at that, Mike, to see if that made any sense at all in this crazy journey you've had.
Oh, it's amazing. And what's jumping out is just speaking to you, having watched the journey for quite a while. We've obviously followed the Hyperledger Fabric journey. We've followed the IBM journey. I think I would hazard a guess that Hyperledger is probably the big name when you think of IBM blockchain, although I'm very aware that there are many, many more initiatives, but maybe that's the one that's got the most airtime. What I'm wondering listening to you speak, though, is you're speaking like a startup founder, but you're talking about working in a global, enormous, massive, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people business known as IBM. How have you navigated that adoption of change? And I mean, like I say, you're speaking you're speaking like a startup founder, except you're pitching to an organization and you're pitching to a corporate. It's kind of within this world. How have you navigated that? Because that's a big machine to move.
Yeah. It is, and just like you would pitch to VCs, we have to get funding internally with the right folks who have the P&L, who have the appetite to be able to make some investments. So what I did was, you need to have some sponsors, like a typical large corporation, and I had to find those sponsors. And I was lucky enough because I spent significant amount of time in middleware, and we did pretty good back in the day. And I think the branding was WebSphere, and and so I reached out to some of the WebSphere sponsors at the time. Which, the people who had trusted me, people who have actually done well in the past and making them successful. So it's one of those things where, just like any other industry, you reach out to people who you've helped, and, it's time to sort of cash in those favors at some point. But at the same time, you also needed client base, because nothing moves in large corporations till clients don't come asking for it. So I in that whole journey, the 65 client bases around the world, traveled to about 16 different countries, and got an inventory of clients who would be interested, and got the use cases to say, I've done my research, and this is what you're going after. In the sense that even if 20% of these clients were to subscribe to what we're trying to build and sell, we break even. And leave alone the 90% of the world's financial institutions and supply chain entities and manufacturing base, medical, healthcare, and so on and so forth. And I think that took me about 18 months to make that case. I was fortunate enough to make that travel and have the leeway to be able to say, let me go to Japan, let me talk to XYZ, let me go to South Africa. I speak to Standard Bank, for example. So I was able to do those and collect that data and have sort of a real life statistics on my own to say, hey, these are the client bases we're going after. And that actually helped. But it was truly a challenge, because there's no VC, and you can't really go and ask for some funding, which I think in hindsight now, in this day and age, is a lot easier to raise funds through VCs, in my opinion, than going after the corporate funding to fund these projects.
Yeah, and I think people like you have made it easier, because you've done the hard work to pave the way for people to say, hey, look, IBM's doing this. Of course it's credible. Now please give me money, VC. And it's because of people like you that have paved that way. Something that's jumped out at me, Nitin, I asked you to give me an intro into your FinTech world, and you immediately went to the blockchain part of that. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. And I guess my question here is, anybody that's involved in FinTech right now, I would hazard a guess that if you're in FinTech, you cannot ignore blockchain. It's just not possible. It's if you're thinking about payment rails, you might have a traditional payments fintech, but you are thinking about blockchain as a disruptive element, or as depending on how you view it, as a maximizing element or a disruptive element. If you are thinking about finance, you're thinking about the protocols like Compound, Aave, etc. You're thinking about how these are disrupting the lending market. If you're thinking about property, you're thinking about fractionalized ownership, etc. What is, I mean, obviously we know you're a big blockchain advocate, so I'm not going to ask you if there is a role for blockchain. What I'm going to ask you is, what is the role of blockchain in fintech at the moment? How important is it? How prevalent is it? And how much adoption do you believe it's getting at a macro level?
Yeah, Mike, that's a brilliant question, and I'm sorry I jumped quickly to blockchain because there were certain assumptions, but remember the whole mobile payment conversation when I was trying to build. I actually had a system and architecture that I was working on, which would facilitate Apple Pay. So Apple Pay, for the audiences and folks who are listening to this, is reliant upon a technology or a framework called EMV code, which is basically chip and pin, which is already there in Europe, and it's not in the US for many reasons. We have the burden of legacy. And at the time, we were trying to remove fraud from online transactions, and there were a lot of fintech companies, early days, Stripe, which today is a 100 billion plus valuation company. You have, Braintree, PayPal was, Venmo was popping up, Klarna, all the household names that are today were fairly starting up, at the time. And we were looking into saying, how do we play in that space while navigating this big machinery called IBM and still being relevant to our financial services institution? So in that conversation, we begin to then pitch and saying, fintechs do two things. They force the industry to transform, whether they're transforming the banks from inside, and that's why banks either partner directly through accelerator programs or go and acquire a fintech, because it gives them access to that DNA and the tech that allows them to transform from within. And then you have the disruptive power of challenging the status quo, challenging the existing business models. So to me, blockchain is an enabling technology that is rather disruptive, while fintech is a broader industry initiative for financial services industry, which is taking the finance and tech and amalgamating the two together to be able to achieve an objective for either transformation or disruption. So I'm classifying blockchain as a disruptive tech because decentralized financing, the names that you rattled off in terms of Aave and Balancer and many of these protocols, are truly trying to promote not just the avenues of a total globe as a marketplace having a single rules of engagement, except that those rules of engagement change at the access points, which means that you simply have to figure out how do you get the ether into the system, for example. But the rules are the same. The moment you have an ether, no matter where you are in the world, which cannot be said about our existing capital market infrastructure or existing sort of lending landscape that we work with. So in many cases, to me, this is extending the whole disruptive power of not just disintermediation, but giving birth to new business models that I think is truly disruptive to the industry in general. So again, fintech transformation, blockchain is taking the transformation to a disruptive edge, allowing the banks to be able to re-envision and reimagine the financial services, which is almost 100 years old, I think, with no changes.
As you're speaking, I've got to ask a question, and it's totally fine if you don't want to answer this because it's defeating in your position. But you clearly have a very deep knowledge set, experience, understanding, network, all of the above, all the things you need to build out a very disruptive technology or startup. Yet you've chosen to stay with IBM for 22 years and not break off. And I'm just sitting here going, I speak to a lot of very successful founders. Many of them come from a McKinsey or a Goldman or an IBM or what have you. And that was their platform and their launch pad to then create technology and effectively partner back in with people they trust from the organization. Yeah. 22 years, you don't seem like you have any intention of leaving. It's okay if you don't want to answer this question, but I've just got to ask, why are you still working with IBM? Why are you not running the next Klarna or Square or Plaid or what have you? If you're comfortable answering, please answer.
You certainly hit a nerve, Mike. I do have some commitments that I have made, and I would say that the original team that founded this, there were three of us, and I'm the last man standing. And so at the risk of not being institutionalized, which oftentimes can happen because you spend so many years with a company, I still have some commitments that I have to make, only because you make a call, and it's primarily, remember when I went to my sponsors to ask for funding so I could build these things, they helped me and they stood by me. And so it's some of that loyalty that goes with it. Some of it is access. If you look at the existing decentralized financing space and all the regulatory and compliance frameworks emerging around the globe, being a part of this large organization that has sort of assisted and aided in building the existing financial system, we get a seat at the table to work with SEC and FinCEN and CFTCs of the world, ECBs of the world, to be able to have a conversation in terms of what the next generation framework should be. So I think there's some element of access, which is important, in my opinion. But at the same time, it's a commitment that you have made, and of course, everything has a life, and the life may run out at some point, and you may have to go back and pursue your dreams. All that is in the play, of course. But to me, I think in many cases that we are at a really critical juncture, especially in the case of the emergence of DeFi and stable coins and central bank digital currencies, and the ability for us to be at the table and have direct access to what the establishment is thinking. At the same time, working with the ecosystem is looking into saying the same ecosystem that's trying to challenge that establishment, there's a synergy there. And I think being at a large corporation, whether it's Goldman or JPMC or IBM, you have front row seats to the cusp and intersection of that, of that challenge and change framework, which I think is an interesting place to be. But of course, everything has a time and place, as you rightly pointed out.
I feel like we might be having a second conversation in some time, talking about
I would love that.
Whatever it is you're building to disrupt all of this in the future. So look, you touched on three massive, let's call it massive pillars or themes in blockchain at the moment and finance, and that is CBDCs, which I don't want to talk about because I feel like it's very controversial and we're probably going to end up getting into a political discussion because that's what I think CBDCs are, and I don't really want to do that. To be clear, I think it's great technology, but I don't really want to go down that rabbit hole. You then spoke about stablecoins and you spoke about decentralized finance, DeFi. Now, one of the questions I'd actually prepped was around stablecoins, and I want to talk about DeFi a little later, but
sure.
We've done some work with stablecoins. We obviously keep a very close eye on it. And, a lot of people think that that's a killer app, that stablecoins, once they are done correctly, is kind of the killer app. But there's a lot of controversy around this. We've got the very sort of well-known controversy in USDT, Tether. They were fined quite seriously. They still haven't opened their books to prove that it actually is collateralized properly. We've then got probably the lesser-known recent, let's call it debacle with Iron Finance, where they were partially collateralized, and that was a big shakeup because Mark Cuban was involved. What I guess I want to ask you is, stable coins to the layman seem pretty simple. It's like, cool, you buy this digital currency and it's represented by the US dollar, and it's pretty simple. It's really not actually that simple. There's a lot of algorithmic stuff going on in the background. There's collateralization, which isn't actually collateralized. What are your views on stablecoins' role in fintech, and where do you see them going? Because those of us that maybe understand this a little more realize that stablecoins are not actually that stable. Like we've got to figure them out still. So just talk to me about what you think about stablecoins.
Mike, that's a loaded and a brilliant question. So let me give you a little history and context, because I did build a payment network called IBM WorldWire. It was a cross-border payment network. I introduced stablecoin in that, as we were building the network, and in that journey, again, I went and spoke to 35 largest banks, because in many cases you do need a financial institution because you're dealing with, as you said, collateralization. That's the whole point. And as I was building the network, I went back and researched every element of why would you want to have a stable coin. So a few things, right? One is there are three fundamental models. If you were to take all the stablecoin projects in the world, it boils down to three fundamental structures. The first, which is the most common one, is centralized IOU, which is basically Mike issues a stable coin, I trust Mike, and I take the stable coin. And if everybody begins to trust an issuer, which in this case is Mike, but let's say if it's a large bank which everybody trusts, then that stable coin becomes a digital denomination of currency of sorts, and that allows you to have a medium of exchange. I wouldn't really call it store of value, but medium of exchange as a vehicle to bring liquidity into these systems, which has been non-existent. The second model is value on chain, which is where many of the newer projects early on basis, which was deemed illegal because they were going after algorithmic elements, were trying to figure out as to how can I create value on chain and be able to transact with the value of chain, which is what Ether and Bitcoin do today. They are as liquid as USD. They are treated as a universal currency of acceptance across all the networks. And then you have DEXs and centralized exchanges and many of the other sort of frameworks, including liquidity pools, that will give you a asset pairing mechanism that allows you to exchange of these highly liquid assets, which you cannot say for the 10,000 plus different other crypto assets that are in the system. And the third thing is something called seigniorage model. It's a complicated French term. And seigniorage is the term the central banks use as the differential between the cost of printing, distribution of money, and the actual worth of money. So in a hyperinflationary scenario, seigniorage will be negative, that you're spending more time in printing money than money's worth, Venezuela and Zimbabwe as an example. And in case of USD, even though we have virtual currency, there's still some amount of money and energy and technology goes into managing the balance between the currency on the ledger as well as the currency that's in print, which is the M1, M2, M3 scenarios of central bank. So anything that's going towards the last model is sort of edging towards having a controversial model which sort of borders with what central banks do, and that is usually been very unsuccessful projects. So let's look at the reason why the first model, which is the centralized RUU model, came into existence. And that's largely because in most cases, people who are not miners, who were not stakers, and who didn't have any clue, but they still needed to participate in this crypto economics models and crypto economic systems that we are creating. And so they had to buy. And that's how we begin to introduce liquidity into these systems to say, we understand a monetary system. And if we simply had to rely upon a purely Ether or purely Bitcoin system, that would be a different problem. But we did need to basically have some vehicle to be able to buy the toll currencies and pay the toll as a transaction fee, which is what Ether does, and so on and so forth. And so that's one reason. Second reason is you're dealing with real-time systems. So any of the blockchain systems, any of the dozen plus layer one systems who are in existence, who are they essentially do one thing. They give you a transaction system, because blockchain essentially is a transaction system, and that's real time. So if I'm relying upon a real-time system, which relies upon the traditional T+1, T+2, which is the time it takes for you to move money from point A to point B, it defeats the whole purpose. So stablecoin came into existence to do two things. One is enable transfer of value, which is giving some level of fungibility and liquidity in a highly illiquid system, to be able to let common people participate, connect their bank accounts, be able to buy and sell crypto assets, and coexist with the existing financial system while we are still evolving and developing this new sort of crypto-based financial system that's in existence. Now, I'll take a short pause at that, because these three modeling and the existence of stablecoin has really accelerated not just the consumption of crypto assets in the broader marketplace, but it also had led to high yield options, which in today's world doesn't really exist, which means there are business models that support issuance, there are business models that support, and I actually spent 18 months in crafting a 4-pillared approach to say, why would a bank issue a stablecoin? And what are the technical and economic imperatives for anybody to issue a stablecoin? So I'll take a pause at that, get your thoughts, and happy to expand more on some of the metrics that I talked about.
It's super interesting, and I mean your understanding and your depth of knowledge there is really impressive. I kind of thought I understood them, and now there's a whole lot of questions running around in my head. An observation I think that I'll make mainly for the listeners, but it's very clear that it's not complete. It's very clear that stablecoins have a place and are accelerating, but they're not finished. They aren't concluded. There is no stablecoin that is like perfect yet. However, what's very interesting is I was actually reading last night is that despite all of this controversy with USDT, with Iron Finance, basically showing quite clearly that stablecoins are not yet stable. Despite all of that, in the last year, we've seen a 4x of stablecoins market cap. In other words, the confidence is rising enormously with the use of stablecoins, even though we acknowledge at large that they're actually not complete yet, which shows to me that the market is showing a pretty massive desire for this medium of exchange and this medium of liquidity, despite the fact that there are risks with it, which I find quite interesting, and some of these lending protocols that we spoke about, Compound, Aave, Notion, or Notional, they're really starting to challenge some of the traditional savings account or kind of where you put your capital. As you said, because in the traditional markets right now, you kind of just can't get a return at all. And, these guys are offering 4, 5, 6, in some cases, 20% returns,
2%,
on pretty low risk digital assets. What are your thoughts? And I realize you aren't an economist, but I'm pretty sure you got some strong thoughts on this. But what are your thoughts on these lending protocols? What are your thoughts on?
Yeah.
Let me be more specific. What are your thoughts on institutions? And I don't necessarily mean the MicroStrategies and the Teslas of the world. I could be speaking about the small businesses. What are your thoughts on businesses and institutions starting to incorporate into their treasury strategy holding Bitcoin or holding stablecoins or using these protocols to actually get a reasonable return on their treasury? I said a whole lot of stuff there. Whatever landed, just hit me back with your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think so. Those are brilliant questions. I think you mentioned the word treasury, which is such an important part because trust me, if you have to look into stablecoins for large bank, you have to talk to two people, not to payments people. You have to talk to risk and compliance people, and you have to talk to treasury people because treasury is a big part of how bank functions. So a few things, right? One is there's a distinction between the Tether and USDC, which is direct mapping of one-to-one mappings of what they're trying to do with saying, and we did that with Stronghold when I was building this payment network. We had to get audit and say, one requirement to be on our network is if you're issuing a stable coin, we need to provide some third-party audit that provides assurance that you have funds and that funds are not used for any other lending purposes. It's a custodian that you need to have. And Prime Trust is an example, and you have many who have popped up over time who are providing that service, right? And Tether, Bitfinex, there's a whole conversation around it. But the hope is that you have to have some requirement, and I think the regulation framework is dealing with that. And then you have the second class of emerging assets coming, which is borderline questionable in terms of what provides stability to these assets. So as we know, that Bitcoin and Ether and many of the cryptocurrencies are volatile. They're not exactly stable. But then you have this complicated algorithmic element that provides the stability in terms of changing the demand supply of many of these frameworks and saying that, if you have the value of X coin, let's say in case of Ion Finance or Fay protocol, for example, is derived by the demand and supply of a governance token combined with people buying and selling a different token, and that balance is really what gives the stability. And those experiments are, in many cases, brilliant, but it's complicated. And I go back to Occam's razor, both in economic terms as well as in technical terms, that if it's too complicated for even economists and intelligent people like yourself to fully grasp the concept of a 2-token, 3-token governance model for a stablecoin, because you're trying to create a model which sort of creates the balance that gives something stability, that is meant to be exploited like every other system in the world, and that gets into complex areas. So to me, I think if you look at the institutional entry into this point, institutions will not do anything they don't understand. That's typically how risk is designed to do these things. That's why I think Bitcoin is the most popular asset with institutions, because it does only one thing. It's value transfer and store of value of unit of account, all the things that a typical currency has to provide. So in that respect, I think that the use of Bitcoin as store of value is secondary. But in many cases, a global institution, and you can take IBM, for example, we work in 170 plus different countries. It's a complex operation to move money across 170 different countries. We use enterprise MTOs, money transfer organizations, to be able to move money, let's say from South Africa or Australia back to United States. And there's a whole element of mechanics that has to happen to be able to move money. And the faster you need, the more costly it is to do that. So the treasury function, which corporate treasury of any company looks into, not just the liquidity and capital pools in different markets and different accounts, but they have to look at the health of the capital needed for short-term obligations, long-term obligations. And I believe that in many cases, Bitcoin can serve that function because it provides that singular value that can be moved at the speed of wire. And so one value that I derived and try to convince a lot of financial institutions is that what stablecoins can do for you, if you can move money at the speed of wire, can you not have a liquidity pool? And that way pool all the liquidity of all the accounts, which today I have to maintain in different jurisdictions, different countries, and be able to move liquidity where it's needed the most. And that's a function that is largely ignored because of valuation and the arbitrage opportunities that these cryptocurrencies offer. But truly global corporations can certainly look at technology as well as these crypto assets to perform that treasury function, which I think is largely lost in the noise. So I'll take a pause at that. And I'll say one more thing, Mike, is that every blockchain guy is an economist. Even though we are not economists, I've read many, many books since I got into blockchain space to look at incentive economic structures, looking into MMTs and looking into rethinking money. So I think all of us are taking a lesson in economics as we do our jobs.
So I think two things jumped out at me there. One, the last thing you just said, that you're totally right, because the Bitcoin white paper was posed as an alternative to the financial system. Therefore, you are, as you say, whether we acknowledge it or not, we are aspiring economists. The second part is you said something almost in passing, and it's just such an important point, is that these are experiments. They're experiments. Bitcoin is an experiment. As much as we might believe in it and have faith in it and confidence, it is still an experiment. And I think it's so important to remember that, is that if you're getting involved in this space, we need to acknowledge that we're still in the experimental phase. It seems to be getting more and more credibility, but they're basically massive experiments. From the wildest projects, I won't mention any, but the crazy wild projects, which are blatantly experiments, all the way through to sort of the stable one, right, which is Bitcoin. They're still experiments, and we haven't quite proven them out yet. And on that note, it's a good segue. There are a lot of countries that are making it very difficult to deal with crypto. I'm South African, but I live in Australia, and recently, I don't know if you've been following, but South Africa has basically made it illegal now to send any form of crypto from the local exchanges to an overseas exchange because of exchange control. They've also said to the banks, you may not process payments from a South African bank account into any crypto exchange. I don't think they've made that part illegal. I just know they've kind of said you can't do it. Nigeria, I think they made Bitcoin, if not the entire crypto market, illegal. China is doing its thing always to make things difficult. These are not good signals, right? Typically, these are like, okay, well, hold on, is this the beginning of the whole world making crypto illegal? We all know you can't stop crypto because you would have to turn the internet off, but you can certainly make it illegal. Now, my question to you is, these are sort of, if you're looking at a high level or at a macro level, which I don't like to do, but if you're looking at the sort of overarching level, where do you see this going? Do you see this happening more and more? Do you see these as fringe cases because South Africa is trying to stop money going out of the country because there are challenges in South Africa? Do you see the same thing in Nigeria? Do you see this happening more and more with more jurisdictions making it illegal? Where do you I don't want to say what's the end game because who the hell knows, but where do you see this going? Do you think we're going to see more of this, crypto is illegal, or do you think these are temporary measures while different jurisdictions try to get their head around this?
So I think it's the latter, and I'll give you many analogies. And I've actually been to, at least in context of blockchain, been to 74 plus different countries and spoken to the governments in terms of what the framework should be. So I've had a first-hand conversation. So a bit of is just the infrastructure, right? And I'll give you a few examples, and I'm not shy in talking about it because we need to have an open conversation in this space, is just lack of having the right framework, the regulatory framework that's needed to do these things, right? And then there's a FUD factor, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which always prompts us to provide a regulatory framework to say thou shalt not do these. And then you have a underground economy that begins to emerge, and at some point you have to deal with that because you cannot ignore it forever. So in my opinion, in IBM, we have a company called Promontory, which is something we acquired, which is all ex-regulators from OCC, SEC, and the entire alphabet soup that make the College of Regulators. And we spent 14 months in figuring out the digital asset regulatory sort of framework, which now we're working with different countries and different central banks and different sort of regulatory agencies. Says it's good to understand these because two things, right? One is technology knows no boundaries, right? So you cannot prevent it. You can do firewalls, you can do all these different things, and you can't really shut the internet because it has other economic consequences. So you might as well understand and embrace it and have the right regulatory framework. But you also are stymieing innovation that may evolve on it, right? And so what Switzerland, which is the most neutral country in the world, and has taken the first step of building a regulatory framework that begins to classify, let's say, virtual asset service providers as an entity, looking at custody as a solution and what needs to be done around it, looking into classifying exchanges. And then they said, we have this framework and you're free to do what you want to do as long as you're adhering to the framework. And if things go wrong, we will come after you. And you begin to see that now happening in ECB with European Central Bank and ESMA and FISMA in Switzerland, ESMA and of course Europe, is looking into this and talking about as to what is the framework needed. And of course, that has now come to the US, where SEC and OCC have. So there's an emergence of understandings to remove the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, building the right regulatory framework, which will then allow the innovators to innovate without fear. But there's also an element, and on the side of many governments, there's an element of nefarious activity that happens which harms society in more ways than one. And there's an attempt to stop that. And our argument has been that cash has always been that instrument that has provided fungibility and transportability of the communication between the nefarious actor in the world anyway. So all you're doing now is speeding it up, except that it's in a network that's transparent, that can be tamed, that can be taken advantage, both from the people engaged in the activity as well as the regulator and the enforcement agencies who have all the tools in the place and which makes the life easier. So I think, to me, it's a point in time, though I think if they begin to see success of the developed economies, and I mentioned a few names, Europe, Switzerland, United States, let's say Australia, you will find that to be able to participate in the global economy, they'll have to change the systems. Just like FATF has done this with AML and money laundering and KYC, which has become a global standard. You'll begin to see that if enough jurisdictions in the developed economy begin to adopt technology as well as regulatory framework that goes with it, it becomes ubiquitous. And at that point, you have to simply stay competitive to participate in that global economic system. And blockchain-driven systems are truly global in nature, as we all know.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of work to go to get those frameworks in place, and it's unfortunate, but I understand why certain jurisdictions just kind of clamp down while they buy themselves time to figure this stuff out. Because in countries like South Africa, where there is instability and very sadly, a lot of bad things going on, I can understand parts of why they're doing it. The execution of it, though, however, I don't think is done very well. But that is a political thing which we'll maybe avoid.
Yes.
So, maybe a decent segue to the next sort of theme, which is, apart from regulatory uncertainty and framework uncertainty, when we think in the context of scale-ups, so not so much the context of the IBMs and the Goldmans of the world, but more the well-funded startups that are doing great work, that are beginning to scale up, and they've sort of raised good funding, they're getting some good traction. What do you think the biggest challenges for these scale-ups are? Aside from the regulatory environment, which is kind of, it's the obvious one, I guess, if you're close to it. If you're not close to it, maybe it's not so obvious. But aside from regulatory uncertainty, what do you see as the major, if we think in the context of this concept, which I love, which is like, look for difficult problems to solve?
Yeah.
Like, what are the difficult problems that need to be solved when you're thinking about scale-ups building disruptive, decentralized technology for the fintech space?
So this is also going to be a loaded response, because I'm also participating in a bunch of VCs looking at investment landscapes. I personally, the things that I cannot do as a part of my job, because we work with regulated entities, I have to find an avenue to channel my creativity in whether I'm investing or advising some of these amazing companies and amazing founders and amazing talent that's in the space to stay relevant, right? So I look at this from two angles, right? The first angle is the hard technical problems. And so, and you have seen, like, I would say there are 137 custody companies have popped up in the last 2 years. Out of, let's say, 12 are relevant. But there are 137 founders who found a niche, and they're trying to go into solving a really critical problem of keeping the assets safe. And then you have companies who are looking into interoperability, which is, you have 800 plus different blockchain networks. Let's say 12 are relevant, the Algorand and let's say Cardano and Ethereum and Bitcoin and XYZ, and there are a few more who are emerging, trying to solve the issue of scale and transaction processing cost and so on and so forth. Interoperability, which is what Polkadot and Cosmos-like projects have attempted to do, is an important one, because I'm not going to carry 15 wallets. I'm not going to have to worry about the complexity each of network has to wallet. For me to make this all simple and easily and user-friendly and dumb it down, I have to have some framework, whether it's built on Web 3.0 infrastructure behind the scenes or built on someone handling the complexity on my behalf. And yes, there's an incentive economic system built behind it. Yes, I'm paying it. I'm paying a transaction cost to the whole thing. But for me to be able to move money from one economic system, let's say Bitcoin, to another economic system, like let's say Ethereum, it has to be seamless, right? So those are really difficult, hard technical problems, but you don't have enough technical talent. I find that the hardest thing for me to find is good people. I mean, you'll find enough programmers and coders, but you do need a specialized skill set to who understands the architecture and systems knowledge of how blockchain functions, the distribution, the decentralization that goes behind it, and how do you implement the incentive economic system, because it's all about incentive economics, because we're relying upon a network effect, and the only way to get network effect is to make it equitable for all the participants in the network. So those are all technical challenges, interoperability being one of them. Looking into, again, I mentioned custody. Custody is still a big problem. That hardware wallets is one thing, but then the institutional custody, these are all need to be resolved in a seamless fashion at an economical cost. Otherwise, the whole system becomes more expensive than traditional finance. And what's the point?
Yeah, and I mean, you almost brushed over those terms because you probably think about them every day. But it's like seamless, right incentives, simplified. Those are things that are incredibly difficult to solve when we're thinking about these problems.
Sure.
Like seamless, sure, it's seamless in terms of the friction being removed, but it's deeply complex to use these things still. My parents don't even know I can't even explain to them what I do for a living. Never mind try to get them to use any kind of crypto systems, right? It's so far from easy to use. The user experience problem is kind of like the problem. It was quite interesting. I had Ricardo Spadney, Fluffy Pony, who's famous for Monero on the show, and he's so great. He's so honest and just direct. I love that guy, and he just still says, Mike, the problem is still UX, man. It's like, yes, we've got to solve the technical problems completely, but it's like we will know when we've solved those problems once the UX is fantastic. When the UX is simple and we don't even know we're operating with a blockchain system, it's just an app that is seamless and beautiful to use and makes sense and is kind of, let's call it catch all, we'll know we're beginning to solve the problems. And I think we're still a long way away from that. And, we see, we build tech for other people. That's what we do. So we're a services company and we enable these companies that you're talking about. And we see a couple of things. The one thing that we see is, number one, almost all of our clients have got a technical team. In other words, it's not that they don't have any technical chops. It's just that they can't find enough of the good technical chops. So they come to companies like ours to say, help us go faster, help us do it better, help us do all of the stuff, because we can't we can't attract enough talent. It's just too difficult to attract the right talent. Number two is my observation, and this is in my small little world, is it's not so much about the quality of your technology that's going to make you successful if you're building a blockchain startup or a blockchain scale-up or even a fintech scale-up. It's more about how are you going to get adoption? Because what we see is sometimes we see substandard products, but with a founding team that has got incredibly good networks, and they will succeed because they've got 6 conversations going with the bank that they've basically pre-sold this and all they have to do is build the product. Conversely, we see some amazing technology being built, but they've got no route to market and it never goes anywhere. And it's just listening to what you're saying. It's I completely agree with it. Is that we've got a long way to go. There's an amazing amount of talent. One of the people that I interviewed actually said, like, the reason they got into blockchain is because they were just watching all the best talent in the world from a technical perspective, just amassing in this blockchain space, and they were going, "Wow, all these smart people are here. I need to be there." So not really a question in that, just really resonating with what you're saying. I'm conscious of time, Nitin. This is, I thought we were 15 minutes in.
I'll add something else to you, Mike. I think we lost some of our best people to Dfinity, which is a lot of ICP, like IBM in general, like a lot of people who are in research, who are focusing on cryptography, who are focusing on consensus, because consensus, believe it or not, is a 30-year-old technology. It's not new. It's new to blockchain because of the economics of how IT systems have evolved. But another thing that I want to mention is that the startup challenges around structure. Traditional VC and now you have a model which allows you to have token raise versus VC raise. Some of them are borderline not even right or legal in terms of how you manage the equity raise or raise funds. So fundraising itself is a massive challenge, and many of us have contemplated using blockchain itself for capital formation. Is a much more meaningful way and so that to me is a separate side of the house, which we can talk about later, I think.
Yeah, and I don't want to go down that route now because, although I'm being naughty because I'm saying what I don't want to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that, the minute you start speaking about ICOs and that sort of stuff, there's just a whole measure of cowboy activity. However, there's also gold in those mechanisms, right? But we'll leave it at that. Nitin, just super conscious of time, we're going to have to get you back on, but I want to move to some maybe slightly quicker questions, just to get into your brain a little bit. So number one, are there any particularly exciting projects that you're following at the moment? Can be in the broader fintech space or blockchain space. Are there any like projects that you're just going, man, these guys, like keep an eye on these guys?
Yeah. So to me, the Aave or the Aave NFT project to me is interesting. I think Aave has done a pretty decent job in terms of commercializing this for common people. But I believe that, so look, finance in general is difficult. The boring finance is boring and difficult for most people. So you can imagine the complexity of DeFi and yield farming, which is much more complicated and niche structures, which most common people simply don't understand. But I'll tell you this. We all love sports. We all have houses. We all love music. And so this NFT space is something which, in my opinion, not because people sold for 70 million. We've been talking about NFT now for 4.5, 5 years, that your identity and your healthcare record and all the things that is unique, it belongs to you and cannot be easily replicated, are all NFTs. I believe that the business model that Aave is trying to address, which is what banks should also try to address, is allowing you to value your NFTs and collateralize NFTs, which is what we call as non-bankable assets, the things that you value. But you cannot go to a bank and say, hey, I need to collateralize this so I can borrow some money against it. Or you, for example, taking your healthcare record and allowing a clinical research firm to research the record and pay you for it. All those models simply don't exist today because of the structure that we live in. So looking at NFT as non-bankable asset really exponentially sort of grows the entire value structure in the entire society and how we begin to view our data and our social networks as true sense of value than simply being okay with likes and tweets. So to me, that is super exciting. And what Aave is trying to do is bring in the notion of bringing NFT in the ecosystem and making NFT exchangeable or lendable for fungible tokens like Ether. I think that to me is not only breaking many of the traditional economic models, but giving birth to many, many more newer business models that are yet to be seen, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And just an anecdote to share on that is in 2018, we did our first NFT project. And just, you'll understand what that means. So 2018, we built our first NFT client for a client. Very sadly, they didn't work. Yet it's really sad because what they were doing in 2018, and we were working on the tail end of the project, so they were starting this from 2016, it was just a timing thing. If they had launched what they were doing then, now, they would be blowing up because companies doing exactly what they were doing are blowing up. And I think there's such an important thing of timing here. As you said, like a lot of the stuff is not actually new. It's just that there's the timing element of this is so incredibly critical. Which is what jumped out for me. Cool. So now, next sort of rapid fire question. You're not a founder, but as I said, you kind of talk like a founder and you think about it and you're dealing with these VCs. So I'm just going to put you in the founder mindset, whether you like it or not.
Go for it.
So with that mindset, what scares you in business?
Incompetence, a lot of that. I think you have good people with good intentions and hard work. And yes, you can fail. But failing because of incompetence to me is the hardest thing you can do, and associating with people who are, going with, get rich quick. Yes, we all will get rich. There's no doubt about that if you're in this space at this stage. But and that leads to a lot of nefarious activity, that leads to a lot of short-term thinking, which I think for me, I'm looking at Web3 as a long-term infrastructure play, which could be the next evolution of cloud, as opposed to looking at how can I maximize my token. So see a lot of founders who are saying, next 3-4 years, let me create this, these inferior coins. I'll use the term and not keep your show clean and kosher.
Let's just call them shit coins because that's what they are.
Let's call them shit coins, right? and the thing is that focusing on that, which takes away from a lot of talent, a lot of intentions, and it gives the industry the bad name. I think that to me is more scary than just plain failures, because 98% of many of our projects have failed. But I have wear as a badge of honor because I take pride in 2% that have succeeded in the work that we do.
Yeah, love it. What content are you currently consuming?
I spend 5 to 6 hours a day reading many reports. I look at Masari because they have a pretty comprehensive report. I look at economic models of various of these tokens. I of course look at the traditional Blockworks and many of the coin desks of the world for news bites, because then you can at least have a big macro framework and then you can dive deeper into what you need. But I also look into scientific journals, which is the papers coming from academia and the IC3s of the world, looking into the next evolution of making zero knowledge proofs and ZK snarks more consumable and more performant and less expensive, and so on and so forth. So it's a multitude of things. Sunday is my 15-hour day research days. I just do nothing but read on Sundays, which is
hold on. Did you just say Sunday is your 15-hour research day? Is that what you just said?
That's right. I do nothing on Sundays, but read and read more. As you know, there's a lot of content, so it's just hard to keep up. That's the biggest challenge that I have.
It's impossible.
But it's interesting. And so you pick your poison and you pick 2 or 3 different things so you can stay humble
and you go deep
and continue go deep. Yeah.
I love that. And I thought I consumed a lot of content, but 15-hour day a week dedicated is another level. What is the last book that you read cover to cover?
The last book that I read was Rethinking Money. It's on my table. It's by Bernard Leitner and Jackie Dunn. This goes back to community currencies, because I need to go back and look into evolution of how money evolved and what are the challenges and what are the failures and problems that happened. But prior to that, I look at if you look at, and this is something which I have to sort of show, is Singularity. Yeah. It's a heavy read, but I'll tell you this, that it brings a lot of constructs of what we're thinking to life. So those 2 are my most recent books. One is business, and I try to dabble between business and science because it keeps it more interesting and diverse, as opposed to sticking to one stream, which is boring sometimes.
What is something that you're doing in the next 7 days to improve yourself or your craft?
That's such a beautiful question, Mike, because I'm heading to Iceland tomorrow for 10 days of no connected and just thinking on my own while walking alone. I do that once a year. I take 8 to 10 days and I go to wilderness. Last year I did that in Peru. I walked the Salcante Trail alone for like 10 days, which you'll be surprised as to spending that time alone without any distractions, whether it's TV or whatever, and just basic. It can give you so much knowledge and so much insight, which is like meditation of sorts. So I'm leaving tomorrow for 8 days to Iceland just to hike and explore the nature, because of course we all have been cooped up, and that window opened up in the past few days. So I just took advantage of that. So that's my thing for the next 8 days.
Oh man, you can expect a call from me in 2 weeks' time to find out what the result of that was. I'm super interested. It's been super great talking with you, Nitin. I mean, I'm inspired. I feel like I've been educated. I just feel like I just want to keep going, but we need to stop. We've almost run out of time.
Sure.
Look, you have a pretty prolific following on LinkedIn, but do you like to be contacted or followed? And if you do, sure, what is the best way for people to contact or follow you?
I think LinkedIn and Twitter are the best. I use LinkedIn quite a bit. Twitter is because you can't express all this in 148 or 280 characters. So I still follow both as professional networks. So those are the best ways to get in touch with me. And you have all my contact information in that front.
And we'll drop it in the show notes. Thanks so much for making the time, Nitin. This was really great, and I really appreciate it.
And Mike, I'd like to compliment you as well. I think what you're doing at Nona and having me come and speak and making, the compliments that you give, and you yourself have such in-depth knowledge in this space, which makes this interview process more fun because you're not just asking silly questions, it's conversation. So I like to compliment you on your skills as well.
Thank you. That means a lot coming from you. And to the listeners who make this possible, I hope you got some value. I mean, there's no ways that you did not get value from today's episode. I usually have a single main takeaway. I don't have one from today, and that is said in the most complimentary way that I can think of. There's just so much going through my head that I need to consider right now. So that is not because there wasn't value, but because there was too much value. So thanks for listening to the show. And if you'd like to discuss your FinTech project with a team of experts in design and development, you're welcome to book a call with one of our principals on our website, which is nona.digital. And I'll be back next week with another episode to explore FinTech and the founders that power it.